Welcome, listeners and viewers, to this very special podcast from the Church of Ireland on the topic of Racial Justice Sunday, an event marked annually since 1995 across the UK and Ireland, and is celebrated on the second Sunday in February. Racial Justice Sunday is observed within a wide variety of Christian denominations and is aimed at addressing issues of racial inequality, promoting racial justice, and fostering understanding and solidarity among people of different racial and ethnic backgrounds. On this podcast, we're speaking with the Archbishop of Armagh, John McDowell, and also with Dr. Maithri White-Dundas and Oluramide Oluso, two members of the Primate's new reference group on ethnic diversity, inclusion, and racial justice in the Church of Ireland. I'm Lucy Michael, and I'm happy to be your host for this podcast. Maithri, can I come to you first? Could you give us a bit more background on what Racial Justice Sunday is and its origins?
Yeah, so I've been reading up a bit on it, and I discovered that it actually originated officially from the death of Stephen Lawrence in 1995. So it was a fact I didn't know. And I found it really fascinating that it took such an act of brutality, mindless brutality for the church to awaken to the existence of racism. Because, I mean, we all know that racism was there long before this death. And I thought someone had to die so brutally.
And of course, Stephen Lawrence was a teenager who was unfortunately murdered.
First Racial Justice Sunday. But I also looked around to see whether there was any other information about continuity of celebrations, and I couldn't find very much, which was also a bit disappointing for me because it seems to have sort of happened and then sort of dropped quite a bit. So the inception really was this brutal death. And, it is a sad thing that we wait until something so tragic happens before we really open our eyes to what is around us and what we can see.
Maithri, tell me a bit more about what Racial Justice Sunday is today.
So for me, Racial Justice Sunday, I was trying to work this out in my head. I think it's a lot of things. So it's the need to look at our past, at slavery, at colonialism, of all the racisms that really have happened in the history of the church, which, to be perfectly honest, we never really acknowledge. And we are sort of embarrassed to kind of know that it's part of our history. So it's like slavery, colonialism, and then currently in this situation, it's the refugee, sort of the violence towards refugees. And we can see it sort of happening before our eyes almost. And you kind of realize racism is so alive. It's so poisonous even today. And I find it quite horrific to actually realize that. So I think Racial Justice Sunday really needs to look at all of that. Those nuances. Yeah.
Thanks, Maithri. Archbishop John, how does acknowledging Racial Justice Sunday in the Church of Ireland align with our church's mission and values in general?
Well, I mean, at the very least, I suppose it includes in the name, the Church of Ireland, and we claim, as it were, to have a ministry to all the people of Ireland in a way, but certainly everyone who claims any kind of Anglican identity, and I think beyond that. So I think that it is this tremendous paradox, which I think the research that we did uncovered, the paradox that people from an different ethnic background look different. They look other than we are. Yet at the same time, somehow or another, they're invisible. And a day like this, I think, helps us in the Church of Ireland just to raise our eyes a little bit higher, to look around us instead of just looking at ourselves, our own sameness, and to realize that there are people from completely different backgrounds, and we probably haven't asked. I mean, another aspect of that research was that people felt that they were continually being welcomed, but not being integrated in a sense, not being asked what they could bring. So I think Racial Justice Sunday just gives us an opportunity to stop to think about how we can begin that process of much greater inclusion and integration.
Great, thank you. Oluramide, I'll come to you now. What do we need Racial Justice Sunday for? Why should we be celebrating it more widely across the church?
We should be celebrating Racial Justice Sunday because if you look at it in the whole sense of it, it's grounded in spiritual and, moral principles that emphasize the inherent, and inherent worth and dignity of all individuals. Racial Justice Sunday calls on, parishioners, church administration to, confront racism, address it, and model ways of inclusivity, of supporting racial diversity in the church, and as part of our collective social and spiritual responsibility to create a just and inclusive Church of Ireland, and by association, the Irish Society. If we look at Isaiah chapter 1, verse 17, it says, learn to do right, seek justice, defend the oppressed, take cause of the fatherless, and advocate the case of widows and, and other vulnerable and underrepresented individuals or groups. So that's, for me, would be, a valid justification for Racial Justice Sunday in Church of Ireland.
Sounds like we need that verse from Isaiah pinned over the desk for us to remember more often. Maitri, can I come back to you then? Why do you think that we should celebrate this more widely across the church?
Partly because I think there is a fundamental truth in Genesis that we are all created equal and in the image of God. And I think racism really destroys that truth. And I think the church, more than any other organization, really needs to uphold that, because that's where we start, that we are created in the image of God. And I think that is such an amazing thing to recognize, that every human being we meet, even if it's a criminal, is still created in God's image. That changes how we see them. The second thing I was thinking, and I just thought of this quite recently, I was thinking when the church was incepted at Pentecost, there is this interesting phrase that every nation under the heavens was there, and they heard the words of God in their own language. And I was reading through that and thinking, there's such a diversity there. Like there were Arabs, there were Parthians, they were so ethnically diverse, culturally diverse, language-wise, they were diverse. But they were there at the beginning of the church. That was the church. Mm. And I think that is what we should restore through Racial Justice Sunday, that image of the church that is so diverse in every way, but yet the body of Christ. And I think for me, that is really what Racial Justice Sunday should do, to bring back that celebration of who we are in Christ.
I love that image. Archbishop John, we've heard from Maitri and Ram what they hope Racial Justice Sunday would do if it was more widely celebrated. What do you think the potential impact is of celebrating it more widely?
Well, I think the first thing is that, as you know, the church, all of the traditional churches find themselves struggling to say whatever the word is in the current circumstances of our society that attracts people, that makes people sit up. And people of certainly a younger generation, my daughter's generation in their 20s, this kind of thing is, it's sort of old hat to them in a way. It's how they look at the world. And we have drifted, people of my generation, Jesus Christ was the first person in history to look upon the whole human race as a unity. And since that time, we have spent quite a bit of time dividing that unity in all sorts of ways, denominationally as well as in terms of race. So we would be being true to that. And it's a very, very, very good example of Pentecost, where there used to be a thing which we all learned at theological college and bored us all to tears about the scandal of particularity, which is a very theological kind of expression, about which was supposed to be an obstacle to people believing how come that it was just in this one particular place, this one particular person, that God revealed himself more fully than he had anywhere else. But as Matthew just pointed out, it was at a time and in a place of immense cultural flux and cultural movement. And the interesting thing about Pentecost, the interesting thing about the influence of the Holy Spirit is that it happens collectively. They were all together in one place. And that's probably the one and only time in the whole history of the church that the whole church was together in one place. And they had this tremendous experience of a unity and of a togetherness. It is, I think, particularly in the Ireland of today, there is no better time to try to recapture that we are all together in one place.
And certainly to learn to get along better, to love one another, to be in community together. It's a lovely opportunity to see where we can go with that. Ron, can I come to you? What do we know about the current state of racial justice awareness in our church?
What do we know? That's an interesting question. Within the church, I know that a working group survey showed that while people, individuals, parishioners, felt that there was racism in Ireland. However, many felt it was nothing to do with them. There's a study by Dr. Anne Lodge that highlights the low level of interest or awareness of the diversity of cultural backgrounds amongst, Church of Ireland members.
That I'm reminded of the old phrase, "I'm all right, Jack," that if it's nothing to do with me, it might be out there, but it's nothing to do with me. And I wonder maybe if that's an affliction very many of us are guilty of, whether in the church or otherwise, that just to say that it's not relevant to me. I suppose this is a great way of showing the relevance to us.
Yeah, and
sorry, go ahead, Ron.
No, I was just going to say that, brings me to what the Archbishop had mentioned about, being visible and at the same time, not being aware of, racial issues that pertain to, non-Indigenous Irish people. So hypervisibility, comes to mind.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Maithri, I'm going to come to you next. We've heard from some of the issues around just a low level of racial justice awareness in the church. We're talking about marking a particular event around racial justice. So does that lower level of awareness affect how we might celebrate this event?
Yeah, I think so, actually, because I feel quite strongly that the church is really not self-aware about what racism is and what it looks like. And I think, to be perfectly honest, like most of us would think and believe that we are not racist. We wouldn't recognize the racism within us. And I think that's a huge hindrance, because we can have racist attitudes, which are sort of camouflaged by niceness. So, for example, there are people who have said things to me, like there was an Indian girl who I know very recently, and she kind of said, I feel very inferior in the congregation. She felt that she was treated quite condescendingly and patronizingly, and she felt really uncomfortable. She didn't feel equal. And people were really nice to her, which was the irony of it. And there was another girl I think I met in Dublin who said she's tired of nice racism. And, there is a point in that we are nice people, but there is a slight racism that we harbor within us, all of us. And we need to start recognizing that, because if we don't, we can't address it. So when we think of Racial Justice Sunday, I always think it's also about us, looking at what is within us and our attitudes and our feelings towards the people, the prejudices we have, the unconscious discomfort. Like if foreigners come to church, like colored people don't talk to them. They're uncomfortable. And you have to ask the question, why? So I think that being aware of our racism is so crucial, I think, in dealing with racist sort of Racial Justice Sunday. You need to know that we are racist, all of us.
It sounds like a real opportunity for growth and learning then, and maybe even to maybe relish a bit of that discomfort, to not feel that we have to be 100% confident that we know it all in order to mark this occasion, that maybe we treat it as an opportunity for learning instead of something that we already know. Maithri, is there a way that you think that parish would benefit particularly from marking Racial Justice Sunday? What might happen in a church if you mark this occasion?
With visibility, with the I'm going to say foreigners, but ethnic minorities in the church. Like, for instance, I always think, why is it we don't hear the scriptures read in other languages when there are people who speak other languages in our church? Just the recognition that scripture is in so many languages. Many different races among us. But also just the conversation, in everyday terms, like if you don't talk about it, it will not come to the surface. And I think conversations are really crucial, one-to-one, just discussions with the rector, discussions in the vestry, just the conversation of beginning to think, are we racist? Are we welcoming? Are we uncomfortable with outsiders? I think we need to have those conversations in the church openly.
Of course, you've mentioned a couple of times attitudes, people feeling that they may not be racist themselves, but I suppose we could also acknowledge that a lot of the things that result in racial inequalities are not actually about attitudes or behaviors of individuals, but about the systems we live in and the way that we can become blind to them and benefit from them without really, I suppose, anticipating those who might not benefit from them.
My husband a good example. He said, the fish doesn't recognize that it is in the water.
Indeed.
And we are like that. We don't recognize the culture and the atmosphere we are living in, and that we are in it.
Well, Dick, we talked a little bit about why we should celebrate Racial Justice Sunday, and in particular the need we have in the Church of Ireland to do it more widely. We know that some parishes already celebrate it, but we would love to see many more parishes thinking about that. But it is on the 11th of February. So Archbishop John, we'd love to know, what might a parish or diocese start with if they want to mark the occasion this week? Is it possible something in a short amount of time, or do they have to wait till next year?
Well, they don't have to wait till next year. I mean, there's a limited amount they could do, and even if it's simply including a prayer, that we all become more aware, or that God enlightens our minds and motivates us to do things that are going to increase justice for everybody. But I mean, the one thing that always strikes me, particularly about people who are relatively newcomers to Ireland, people who are newcomers always welcome an invitation, or nearly always welcome an invitation. If someone says, look, come along with us on Sunday, or come to dinner or something, it's nearly always has an impact far beyond the effort that's required to do it. But if you start small, listening or asking someone to read or whatever it might be, there's no reason why you can't then build. And I was very, very struck by the man who made that speech during the General Synod debate, where he said that his parish just went round and invited everybody to a dinner. And I think, much to their surprise, everybody turned up. It was a marvellous. And that whole idea of breaking bread with people, and it's so central to Jesus' hospitality. And, hospitality is this openness to others and to strangers. And that was supposed to be one of the great characteristics of the church.
And I think we all felt that during General Synod, those of us who were there, right through the whole, hundreds of people really felt that sense of community and church come from what he said, describing about how they, week after week, gave English classes, how they invited people in, how they really went out into the community to find others who would celebrate with them the kinds of values and way that we like to mark our own values as Christians. So I'm really glad that made such an impression on you. It certainly did on me too, and I'm sure it did on some of the people listening or watching this podcast. Could I come to you, Ram, and just ask you maybe for some other ideas of what a church could think of doing to promote the message of Racial Justice Sunday, either around the 11th of February or otherwise?
Yeah, I'm just so, I'm blown away with this, testimony about the clergy inviting everyone and everyone turning up, Anyway, don't let me get carried away. I'll bring myself back. So, as well as including a prayer, as Archbishop John had mentioned, there's so many ways that, even as a start, writing an article in a parish magazine, holding a reading group, what are they reading? Reading maybe Bible verses in their language, in respective, indigenous languages, even us Gaeliga, sharing, CTBI resources with, parishioners, highlighting sections, different sections, that people may find interesting. And also, just to say, February is Black History Month. So ideally, where there are parishioners from Black African, communities, it's, celebrating Black History Month with, in the church, as well as, during the Anti-Racism Month, which is March, and it's the official Anti-Racism Month in Ireland, to refer back, to reference racial justice Sunday, and even, what does racial justice mean? Those are ways that, I suppose racial justice can be promoted within, the church as a whole.
That's great. Thanks, Graham, for those. Matthew, can I come back to you? How do different types of Racial Justice Sunday activities, as we say, lift our eyes and deepen our faith and connection to the world?
Yes, I'm going to say something rather unusual, because my awareness and awakening to the sort of the issues of racism came through my undergraduate degree. It didn't come from any Bible studies or theology or anything. And I think for me, there was fiction and poetry that really, it really moved me sometimes to tears, to kind of see what people felt, how people were treated. So I remember reading Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness and just being broken. I had known about slavery, but I didn't see it. And then there were poems by Maya Angelou, the pain of being treated a certain way. And I think maybe the church should I would like to say the church could have a reading month. Instead of, meet weekly, read something and come back to discuss it. Because I think literature is powerful, poetry is powerful. It can touch you in ways that other things can't. And because that was my experience, and I know a lot of my colleagues felt the same way. We used to be crying sometimes after the lectures and reading the poems. It was so sort of painful when we listened to some of the stuff. And I think we need that kind of awakening to what other people feel. So maybe my recommendation would be, think of some poetry evenings, some reading of fiction and talking about it, because I think that's really powerful. Because the Bible really is literature. And it's powerful because it's literature, I think.
I love that idea of stretching our idea of what we might read together in church, that we're not just only reading the Bible or related texts, but actually really drawing our wider interests back into the church. Because I think that, as you say, that does deepen our connection, the world that we live in every day, and the place that we go in order to have this particular community of faith. I love that idea. I thought you were going to say about the power of prayer or reflection, but you've blown me out of the water with that one. I love that one. And just last week, I was listening in Belfast to a preacher talking about the power of psalm and poetry, the Psalms as poetry, and the power of reflection there. So I love that you brought that up. Look, folks, I'm going to take us to the theme of migration, because churches together in Britain and Ireland who have been promoting Racial Justice Sunday now since 1995, and they do a beautiful set of resources available online every year. And we're going to share the link for that with the podcast. But this year is the theme of migration. What they say really is that this is such a topical issue this year. Previously, they talked about COVID, they talked about Black Lives Matter, but this year it's very much about migration, is the word on everybody's lips. And they cite the statistic from the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, which is that at least 108 million people around the world have been forced to flee their homes. And among them are more than 35 million refugees, of whom around 40% are under 18, children. So what do you think might be the important issues in relation to migration that might be useful for members of the Church of Ireland to reflect on this year? Archbishop John, I'll come to you first.
Well, probably Ron and I three would have, as it were, a much better instinctive understanding of what that should be, because they have felt, in a sense, what it's like to be in this society. But from people in my position, I think it's important, and particularly at the moment where there's now unquestionably going to have a very widespread across lots of places in the world debate about migration and immigration. There's no doubt that that's now at the absolute centre of everyone's political agenda. And it's partly there because we avoided it in the past. We didn't have a grown-up conversation about it.
Ron, can I come to you on that same question? Are there important issues in relation to migration that might be useful for members of our church to consider?
Oh, significantly, Lucy. As as Christians, we need to confront racism as a moral and spiritual issue. I was listening to the radio this morning on my way to work, and the presenter was reporting on migrant workers. This is in addition to the already the existing migrant population, the refugees coming in, those in asylum system, within the asylum system, but also the potential for increase in my population of migrant workers, who are already a significant population. So migrant workers will be those who were internationally recruited, mostly within the health sector, to come and work in Ireland. So that is the reality. And, that is the new norm. That is that is the change. And that is the new norm. How, does the church, or what will the church, prepare or plan to do in relation to Christians from this cohort who will be our parishioners? So the issue really is confronting racism, taking responsibility, as we have been, commandeered to do. If you look at Micah chapter 6 in verse 8, it says, "And what does the Lord require of you?" This reminds me of bracelets, this type of wristbands that used to have, "What will Jesus do?" So what will Jesus do? That is our, that should be really our mantle. It should be our mantra. Micah 6:8, what does the Lord require of us? And in doing that, how do we do that, with compassion? How do we do that with compassion and empathy, as Jesus would do? Thank you.
I love, Ron, that you've mentioned this, the different categories of migration, because I think a lot of attention has been on asylum seekers and refugees. Often the two are conflated anyway, but we've seen in Ireland right across the last year really a ramping up of anti-refugee and anti-asylum seeker and more broadly anti-immigrant hatred, but just even that bubbling under of anti-immigrant sentiment has been quite disturbing to see. And yet when we look at migrant workers who are come specifically just to work in the country, they've never been treated that well either. We can look at some of the issues that, for example, Indian nurses who are Christians from Kerala are experiencing in the health service, the kind of discrimination and harassment that was in the newspapers just a few months ago, that they have finally come forward and said how terrible the conditions have been for them. So, I think you're right. We have to really stretch our imagination, that this is not about saying, oh, well, there's one group that we have to look after, but really emphasizing the diversity of issues here. Maitri, I'm so glad you could rejoin us. So I know the internet connection was a little dodgy, but we have you back and we're really glad to do that. I'm going to I just wanted to reference the churches together in Britain and Ireland this year gave us very usefully 3 R's, not reading, writing and arithmetic, but actually 3 R's to help us guide our work in marking Racial Justice Sunday. The first one was remember the importance of racial justice. The second was reflecting on human diversity and thanking God for it. And the third one was responding by working to end injustice, racism and ignorance through prayer and action. So Archbishop John, I'm going to come to you last to ask you this. Whether or not we mark Racial Justice Sunday on the 11th of February, what can we do beyond that to engage our members in conversation about racial justice right through the year?
Well, I suppose the first thing you said, it sounds very simple, is we have to want to do it. We have to intend to do it, to decide that this is an issue that needs to be on the agenda and fairly high up the agenda. So it can be discussions around representation in select vestries. It can be discussions around how we as Christian people and whose primary identity is in Christ see our relationship to all of these other issues. But for the Church of Ireland and for each of us, I think it is that whole business of intention, that we recognize that, when I go in to a restaurant to have something to eat and I look and the guy who's washing the dishes is always black, there's got to be something wrong. If that happens again and again and again, and there has to be a recognition that that is an extraordinarily, it's almost more than an injustice. It's a kind of cruelty to people. And heaven only knows what that person's potential is. To begin to, I suppose, at least speak in those ways so that people realize that it is, a gospel issue.
Ron, what are your thoughts? Are there other things that churches can do throughout the year to engage members in conversations about this?
Well, engaging members, if we look at the Bible as a whole, the Bible reflects the current day. People migrate, there's migration, there's interracial marriage, there are migrant workers, there are refugees in the Bible. So it's about how, engaging parishioners within the, liturgy, welcoming for the clergy. The clergy have a role and parishioners have a role, but clergy have leadership role. Each parish clergy and, like established members within the clergy. For example, in my church in Nigeria, the Archbishop Vining Cathedral in GRA Lagos, they have a welcoming committee. So what happens during church service, new parishioners or people who are coming for the first time are asked to, identify or show themselves. And then the members of the welcome committee, move towards them, say hello to them, meet them at the end of the church, ask if they would like to come back. There's tea and coffee, and they introduce the church, introduce themselves. And in that way, they are made to feel welcome. So I believe that, making new people welcome is the first step. Even if we start from there, it will go a long way in, ensuring sustainable and enduring, inclusivity and, racial and cultural inclusion.
I think Archbishop John, you mentioned earlier that sometimes there's a temptation to keep welcoming people after the first welcome. So what Rom says is very important, that people do get that welcome when they first come in. But I think that deeper welcome as well is really important. As you say, and in future podcasts, we're going to deal with the issues around how we really get people to take on a role in the church and embed themselves. I met somebody recently who was welcomed to the church who'd in fact been on their select vestry for 20 years.
Okay.
But because they were of an ethnic minority background, it was assumed they were new to the church. So I know, Archbishop John, you'll have thoughts about that in future podcasts, and I hope you'll share them with us at that stage.
Yeah, no.
Well, look, thank you both so much for your contributions today, and to Dr. Maithri Dundas White, who has, unfortunately, we've lost connection with, but she's been fabulous. As we celebrate Racial Justice Sunday on 11th of February this year, either in our own parish churches or by joining with others in prayer in other places, we can acknowledge now that the need for this occasion to be marked in the Church of Ireland is sincere. For churches who have not previously celebrated Racial Justice Sunday, there's plenty of time to get ready for next year. But as Archbishop John has said, of course, there's the option to add a prayer or a simple recognition of it this year, so we don't put off the task for any longer. And we heard from Maithri and from Rom about the need to extend our reflections right across the year and weave those lessons into our engagement with the whole church. So listeners and viewers, we heartily encourage you to check out the resources from Churches Together in Britain and Ireland, which we will provide the link to, and those will support your reflections and hopefully inspire your Christian actions in this matter. I want to thank Archbishop John, Dr. Matthew White and Olorimade Alusa for their valuable insights and willingness to engage in this important conversation with us. We invited you to continue this conversation through your local church or diocese and connect with others who can learn and grow with you as you explore this area more deeply. And we will be back with another podcast soon to share thoughts on another area of this matter. This podcast has been produced by the Primate's Reference Group on Ethnic Diversity, Inclusion and Racial Justice. And we'll hope you'll listen out for those future episodes as we seek to learn and grow together with you in faith. Thank you very much, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.
Excited to be here.